Hello, everybody. Good evening. A big welcome to our art talk highlight, Sarah Morris in conversation with Isabelle Graw here in the Hall of Contemporary Art at Deichtorhallen Hamburg. And I'm very pleased to welcome our special guests, Sarah, who came all the way from New York to Hamburg, and Isabelle Graw, back in her hometown, from Berlin. Great to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for being here, for your interest. It's great to see such a big crowd here. And I think maybe now is the right time for a big welcome applause to the two guests of us, Isabelle Graw and Sarah Morris. Great. The talk is held, obviously, on the occasion of the major solo exhibition of Sarah Morris, All Systems Fail, spanning around over 30 years of your art practice, featuring like 180 works, including many of her iconic paintings and all her films, and more. And the title of the exhibition, All Systems Fail, lead us somehow to the core of her art, which reflects systems, political conditions, or economic structures visible around us. And through her use of urban reality in her films and vivid, complex abstractions in her paintings, she creates a new language of place and politics, open for interpretations, and giving us a sense that we are all part of a larger system. Her works being exhibited worldwide, she is considered as one of the most intriguing artists of her generation. And I'm very happy, Sarah Morris, that you are back again in Hamburg. The talk of you will be joined by the art critic and author Isabelle Graw. Isabelle Graw is a professor for art history and art theory at the Staatliche Hochschule für bildende Künste, Städelschule in Frankfurt. In 1990, she founded the art magazine Texte zu Kunst together with Stefan Germer, who really died much too young. And so far, she co-edited and conceptualized, I think, 119 issues. I hope that this number is correct. In 2003, you co-founded the Institut für Kunstkritik at the Städelschule together with Daniel Birnbaum, and the Tagesspiegel once called her the most important art intellectual in our country. You published numerous texts and books, and among them recently from Nutzen der Freundschaft from 2022, or what was it, about the definition of painting, about a Genealogie einer Sonderstellung, the love to painting, and from 1917, and from 2008, der Kunstpreis, die Kunst zwischen Markt und Celebrity Culture. And this evening, these two outstanding art persons will discuss the exhibition by Sarah Morris, will talk about the art of the works of Sarah Morris and the thoughts behind it. And I think this will be a very exciting and inspiring evening for all of us. And a big thank you to Annette Sievert. She's an old buddy, friend of Isabelle Graw, and she had the idea to bring these two together here in Hamburg. Thank you, Annette Sievert, for that, and thank you for being here. And now I pass the word over to you.
Okay. First of all, thank you Annette Sievert, who was already mentioned, Dirk Luckow, thank you for introducing us, Francis Fürst, thank you for doing all the logistic works, and also thank you, Sarah, for having this conversation with me, and thank you, Hamburg, my hometown, to be here. This is fantastic, and I prepared a couple of questions or reflections, rather, on your work, Sarah, that I thought we could discuss, possibly we should discuss for 1 hour, a little bit more, and afterwards we'll open the floor to you, the audience, and we would be happy to take questions, also objections, comments, whatever you would like to say. And the first topic I wanted to address, and it's a topic, Sarah, that has preoccupied me since a long time in a theoretical way, but also when thinking about paintings and when thinking about your paintings in particular, and I thought of focusing on your paintings first. The topic is labor, artistic labor, to be more precise, because I always had the impression, even early on, when contemplating your series such as Midtown or Capital, when looking at the very shiny, opaque surfaces of these paintings that derive from the use of household gloss paint, I always felt these are fetishes. These are working exactly how Karl Marx famously described the fetish commodity, which eclipses artistic labor, which eclipses the labor that was expended for it. And and it's similar with your surfaces. They are so opaque. They remind me at times, sport cars or luxury jewelry boxes, and they seem to kind of, deliberately bury their conditions of production underneath them. There are no traces of the handmade. They are basically following in the tradition of machinic paintings. And I wanted to know if and why you are interested in eclipsing the process of their making in this way.
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I love machines. I mean, I know that's been said before by others, but I love the machine. I think that it was a very deliberate, I remember being in Times Square and sort of thinking about these two sort of polarities in making work. And on the one hand is like the very subjective, the figurative, and on the other hand is the machine and the ready-made. And it was clear to me very early on that which side I would be on. Mm-hmm. And so that was a very deliberate decision in which way to go. And I was always very interested in graphic design and typography. The first paintings, as you know, mm-hmm. are text paintings. I was very, it was a very deliberate decision to force myself not to
touch.
Well, no, the touch is there. I see it everywhere in the work. So I don't think the conditions are buried.
I mean the literal touch, like the brushstroke touch. I'm talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very deliberate decision not to do that and to avoid that, even reject that, because it was something that I viewed as much more of a fetish than what you're talking about with the idea of the commercial or the vernacular of the commercial. So for me, that was like, it was sort of no contest in a way. Like, to me, all of the people that I was interested in as artists were in that direction. And I actually felt like, obviously there's exceptions. Kippenberger, Brothaus is sort of like on the fence, but I think that it's very clear that that the people that I was most interested in were also using that vernacular.
And even Kippenberger's handmade paintings mock the handmade.
Yes, of course, you can say that but still they're figurative
Sure.
painting. But just the idea of you can go with him, the idea of the businessman, the idea of the BMW, the 7 Series, like all of that felt much more alive and much more productive as a source of labor than the abject, than the marginal, than the idea of art being somehow on the side of things, not being in the center. Mm-hmm. That was like a very deliberate decision. And it wasn't even really like a decision, it was just more like you were aware that there were things in an arena, and it was very clear to me. I mean, you have to put it into context. When I moved to New York, it was very, Neo Geo had just happened. Pictures generation was like very, very strong. Barbara Kruger, Jenny Holzer, Louise Lawler,
Sherry
Levine, Richard Prince. Yeah, did I say Jeff Koons? I mean, yeah, I mean, there was a number of people active. Now, of course, on the other side, there was like David Solly, Sandra Kia, Julian Schnabel. This was not, to me, this was not interesting. This was like not, nothing I was even remotely considering.
It's interesting because what is implied or often implied in this model of the machinic painting, and we encounter this already in Andy Warhol's silkscreen, is a delegation of labor. Labor gets delegated to assistants, to others. And this delegation of labor, as many artists practiced it, even Duchamp I would mention here, but let's stick to Warhol. This delegation was seen at the time around the 60s and 70s as a way to undermine authorship, as a way to undermine this notion that a singular author would produce a unique painting. But then one started realizing that authorship only gets reconfigured and expanded due to these...
There's really no way to avoid authorship.
There's no way...
No.
Yes, I would even go so far as to say that delegation strengthens authorship because the artist who initiates the delegation is credited for it. Mm-hmm. But there is a price to pay for this delegation model, which is the artist as a managerial type who uses other people's labor. Mm-hmm. That's the flip side, so to speak, of what could be considered progressive about delegation. It also implies a model of the artist as manager, as someone hiring others.
I think that the role of bureaucracy in making art, if you're going to talk about production, is there whatever type of work you make. Whether you're doing performance, or whether you're making films, whether you're making photography, whatever you're doing, there is a form of bureaucracy that takes over. In fact, it's like the ghost of production. Yeah, is this bureaucracy that, in a way, with my work, I mean, obviously I make fun of this, and this is, if you see the vitrines and see the manuals and you see sort of the structures that were set up, this is like a very self-conscious thing, but it's. I would say that this bureaucracy is throughout making any type of work, whatever the work is.
Increasingly so, due to also certain.
I mean, look at the iPhone.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like you have this level of never-ending bureaucracy.
Yeah, non-stop bureaucracy, non-stop. And when you mentioned the vitrines, I was thinking then when I just walked through your exhibition, I was thinking this is interesting. The paintings kind of eclipse processes of labor. The vitrines kind of attempt to point to the actual conditions of productions. And the films, even more interestingly, constantly revolve around not artistic but general labor. You constantly in your films, like for instance, when watching Abu Dhabi, there is a scene where you kind of film the labor on construction sites. You film a team that is cleaning a floor until it gets as shiny as the surfaces of your paintings. We see, in Points Online, we see window cleaners. We see the kitchen team working in the Four Seasons. So there's an obsession with what Marx would call general labor. And I was wondering, because this is so interesting for me, are you trying to say artistic labor and general labor have become very similar, or are you trying to say artistic labor is very specific and here's general labor, it's different?
No, it's just all the same thing.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, it's all the same thing. Like, I mean, there's no end to the cleaning. There's no end to the bureaucracy. There's no end to this sort of categorization of type. And these are things that are going on, you know, obviously, whether it's your phone, your mind, in the studio, whatnot. I mean, these are forms of whatever you want to call it, late capitalism. This is just like contemporary life. I don't think it's specific to the artist, actually.
But wouldn't one have to say that artistic labor, while overlapping increasingly with general labor in many ways, I mean, think of all the creative subject that sit in enterprises of all kinds, or think of artistic virtues such as creativity and flexibility that are asked for from workers nowadays. But on the other hand, like next to this
or
kind
even
of,
consumers.
Yes, but next to this kind of increasing overlap between artistic and general labor, I think that artistic labor is still more privileged than, say, the labor of a creative worker in an advertising firm, because, and this is due to the specificity of the object that results from this labor. It's unique. It's referring back to a singular author, which is the artist. It can be, and it is also carrying the name of this author and its material. So all these things, I think a creative worker can only dream of these privileges. Wouldn't you say so? Perhaps,
but it's, well, I'm not sure exactly what your point is in this regard. Do you think that, are you trying to say that this general workforce privileges the unique
No, I'm saying
object?
that, no, I was answering to your statement that it's all the same.
Yeah.
The labor that you show in the films of a cleaning team cleaning the floor, or of construction site workers, it's all on a kind of line of continuity with artistic labor. And I was arguing that despite the overlaps between artistic and general labors, which certainly can be, which certainly increasingly exist, there is something very specific to artistic labor because it's more privileged due to the product that results from it, which is a unique object.
You're probably correct. But one of my favorite books is by Pierre Bourdieu, and it's called Distinctions. And I think I have it in my library. I don't know if somebody borrowed it, but it's a fantastic book that talks of this hierarchy that you're speaking of. And everything in your refrigerator has a hierarchy. Everything in your kitchen has a hierarchy. You know, these are just like the facts of how we think. Sociologically, psychologically, this is how we think. And of course, art, of course, has a unique position, as does a book, as does music. You know, I mean, we're talking about art.
I wanted to get at this theory I have, but maybe it's a projection. As you know, critics project a lot. And they also project according to their own theoretical obsessions. So my projection was, when I saw your films again, and I saw a lot of them in preparation for this, I thought, oh, interesting. She is eclipsing labor in her paintings, and she's compensating for that in her films, where there's constant focus on labor. Well, but I'm on the wrong track, possibly.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's definitely like labor is all around us. It's unavoidable. You know, it's not possible to film anything or to picture anything that isn't authored, whether it's a chair, a yogurt, I'm thinking of Bourdieu, but it's not possible to think of these things without thinking of sites of production. But I think probably more importantly, the way I think of these arenas is this type of activity is going on. Not only are we consumers and we're buying into all of this structure, including, you know, the iPhone with all its apps and all the rest of it, but we're buying into it constantly. And these arenas, I think going more importantly, these arenas, whether they're film or, you know, the film's sort of Los Angeles with sort of film production and sort of the star vehicle, or whether it's architecture with all of that, or whether it's, you know, a mail sorting facility in Washington, D.C. These sort of like sites of production are interesting. They're interesting how they're organized, and many of them are organized very differently than art production, obviously. So these things, I've never thought of them as like off topic. Like to me, these arenas are, of course, interdisciplinary. They always have been, but there's a lot of forces that try to keep these areas very separate, and they're not actually separate. Like, actually, graphic design has always been part of art. The machine has always been part of sort of the city.
I totally agree, and I think one could even go further and argue that even the use of industrial paint implies other people's labor that gets somewhat used in your paintings, at least metaphorically, it's other people's labor.
I always loved that. I always loved the idea of the simplicity of adopting that structure, whether it's the palette of Dulux, which is a paint brand in England, or, you know, using these sort of ready-made forms, which of course, you know, there's been many other people who've done it. Donald Judd used RAL, red, orange, you know, all of these sort of, the palette of him, for example, what you're talking about with Warhol, the silk screen, these techniques are just tools. I mean, it depends what you're going to say with them, right? I mean, these are just, it's normal to use them. And for me, it was even more normal to use them because, it has to be said that, like, I taught myself how to paint. I did not go to art school. This is an important sort of element, because in that was a freedom, because if you look at my generation of artists, like, no one paints, right? So why do I paint? You know, because it wasn't a forbidden zone for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, you use household gloss paint a lot, which is something that Frank Stella used as well, but Frank Stella, I think, used it for different ends. You know, he wanted to kind of decharge his paintings from anything transcendental, mystical, and make them look like the work of a, you know,
But didn't Jackson Pollock use household gloss?
He did as well. Yeah, not always, but I think that there's something different happening in the way you use household gloss paint, and this is now an attempt to look at your work in a gendered perspective. Because I think that, for instance, the way you use and choose colors, like starting with Liar up to, say, People's Bank Los Angeles, for me, you choose and apply colors and juxtapose colors in a way a fashion designer like Yves Saint Laurent would kind of juxtapose his colors. And even, you know, and early on when I saw your paintings, the color, these opaque, shiny colors make me think of nail polish. So, plus the use of household gloss paint also somewhat points to the private household sphere. As for me, it's a bit as if you took elements from the private sphere and upgraded them in order to claim that this is modernist now. And this is because of the way you use hard-edged abstraction or grids. The grid and hard-edge abstraction are modernist devices, and you use that, but also kind of infiltrate that with kind of a whole language that comes more from a kind of sphere that is usually connotated female. So that is very interesting to me, because it makes me think of artists like Bridget Riley or even Rosemarie Trockel, who also claim modernism for their paintings by injecting these elements from a female life world?
I don't know what to say to that. I think that, like, I remember one of the first essays that you wrote on my work when I lived in Berlin, which was a long time ago. And I think you wrote, I can't remember where this was published, but I remember reading it, and you were sort of coming about it and speaking about this sort of gendered, sort of commercial sort of zone of the use of color. And I remember thinking, this is sort of interesting. I'm not really sure where she's going with this, but I sort of was like, I of course wanted to reject that immediately. But I think you might be, I mean, for sure, it's impossible to use color without sort of a theory of gender, of course. And the commodity form is gendered, right?
Yeah, and you somewhere said, I read a couple of interviews with you, and you somewhere said, I love the color red. So I was like, why?
I don't know. I have no idea. But I think it's actually like, I mean, what you're talking about is really this use of commercial vernacular. Whether or not, I try to think in terms of like strategies of seduction. So for me, like when I was making the text paintings, I wanted to sort of mimic this adrenaline of advertising, of signage, of things that I responded to. So like, I can't say that where exactly they're from, but I was trying to sort of mimic that pulse. Whether or not I think it actually comes from the world of like cars or fashion or boxes or packaging. I mean, I love all of those things.
And beauty items, yeah.
Yeah, nail polish,
lipstick.
The rest. Yeah, I mean, those are all fair game. But, some of those things, in terms of gender are not just female, right? Those,
of course.
The history of that production and those products.
It can be a kind of queer glam as well, of course. And
that's interesting.
Something also that struck me about your work when thinking about it now in terms of modernism. I was thinking about the grid and the way you use gridded structures. Because historically, art historians like, say, Rosalind Krauss always argued the grid is the modernist device par excellence, which is supposed to be a way to overcome illusionism, to overcome the figure ground tension and to produce flatness. But in the case of your paintings, grids kind of do something else. They produce both a sense of flatness and a sense of illusionism. And even when I looked today at the Los Angeles series, I felt like, oh, the grid is exploding, it gets fragmented. It allows even more for a sense of illusionism and fiction, if you want. So it becomes, this device that refers to both a material reality that is illusion and fiction at the same time. So this is very different from the modernist discourse on the grid.
Well, I think that the grid, it's constantly, I don't know, the way I think about the eye and the way I think about perception is that the eye is pulsing and it's moving around constantly. And one thinks in categories, and that type of categorization could be viewed as a grid. Whether it is a grid or not, it's disintegrating as one is moving through space, as one is consuming, as one is working, as one is living. And it's sort of impossible to get away from it. But it's not a solid thing. It's constantly in flux. It's fragmentary. I don't think it's really like a solid thing that is.
No, the grid always implies infinity. It always implies that it is a fragment of something that continues.
Well, I love that. I love that because it's like, to me, I love the idea that a painting can generate another painting. Mm-hmm. That a painting, I was talking about this last night, it's almost like sort of spider plants, mm-hmm. you know, that they're like constantly fragmenting and making something else, that it's splintering. It's sort of like a rhizome, you know, like formation, that it's just ongoing, it's non-stoppable. And you have this, when I'm, you know, in the studio or I'm here or even elsewhere, I'm sort of thinking of this expanding flow of painting, right? And of these images that I'm seeing and thinking about.
Well, the
how to structure.
This is the effect of the installation. You know, the expanding, like one painting expands into the next. That's exactly the effect the installation had on me.
And that's why I set it up with, you know, having a sort of baseline of the certain scale that you know, have used sort of from the beginning, is because I wanted there to be this like constant sort of unfolding, like a series of dominoes. Yeah. That, you know, that I would produce these things and then they would, you know, sort of all line up.
And there's also something interesting, to go back to the grid one last time. What's interesting to me is via the titles, say, you know, of all your series, mm-hmm. there's a reference to existing social conditions. You know, they refer to existing social conditions. But then the grids are diagonal. And kind of, for me, this diagonal grid thing is a way to underline that this reality that gets depicted here is, on the one hand, it's real, but it's also fictional. It's
totally.
Both.
It's
you know?
Completely fictional.
And this is very different, say, to an artist like Peter Halley, you know, who mm-hmm. really wanted his kind of cells and conduits, as he called it, to refer to a concrete mm-hmm. social reality. In mm-hmm. your case, the title gives one a hint as to what this could be like based on, but then the diagonal...
They are fiction.
They are fiction.
They are fiction. Yeah. I mean, if a painting is called Revlon Corporation, I don't think we have this painting in the show, but there's a really great painting.
I know, I love it.
Called the Revlon.
It's also very lipsticky.
Yeah, not really.
Oh, I
not unless you wear
so.
Purple lipstick. But you know, there's a painting called Revlon Corporation, and honestly, if you went to the Revlon Corporation headquarters, you're not going to be seeing anything. You know, this is. To say it's based on any form of reality is really a stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though, okay, your paintings are also diagrammatic. And the diagram, I think, is a way to refer to concrete realities while abstracting from them at the same time. So I do think that due to the diagrammatic character of your paintings, there is a kind of, how can I describe it? There is a link to the real, which gets at the same time exploded via the diagonals, for instance, and also via this diagrammatic language that is abstract throughout.
Well, I love diagrams, and I love instructions. Everywhere. I love instruction manuals, but I never read them. But I love the idea of you know, if you looked at my work as sort of diagrams, which I actually do refer to them as diagrams as I'm working on them, once they start becoming phenomenologically a painting, I stop referring to them as diagrams. But all of these diagrams are going on constantly in the way we interpolate, sort of moving through space. And I don't mean architecturally, I just mean like moving, consuming, living, sort of occupying, you know, whether it's thoughts or whatnot. And you can even look at, you know, there's certain paintings, like even Department of Water and Power, which we do have here, is, to me, it could be also a diagram of all these different arenas that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it could be a map of the labor that you're talking about. It could also be a map of the way one could think about cognition. Yeah, that it's not, that I think it's more of, increasingly I sort of think it's more about that. But of course, on a level, because of the way I titled them and whatever, it does make a map, sort of a monopolistic, like the game of Monopoly, I mean, not my Monopoly. But it does make a form of like a monopoly in the sense of it creates a type of real estate of space, of places we're familiar with or know about or read about, think about, consume.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's one painting in the show which I think could be working as an illustration as what we are talking about. It's the Pools Monaco painting from the Miami series, I think from 2003. And it, according to its title, it depicts a pool, but then there's no blue to be found in it. That's one of my favorite ones, which makes it so clear that we are dealing with something fictional and abstract. But I think this hint to social conditions is nevertheless important because it somewhat loads the painting with social reality. I think that's important as well. We can't completely get rid of that. Because,
there's no way to get rid of that. It's an impossible thing. I mean, I was talking last night too. I mean, honestly, the city increasingly is a very antagonistic form. Sometimes quite boring too. But the city is an antagonistic form. Why is it an antagonistic form? Because the space, the negative spaces that occupied the city, I don't know whether this is the same in Berlin or not, but definitely in New York, the negative spaces that existed in the city that artists occupied or others occupied in different creative industries are disappearing. So then you end up with a different type of flatness, yeah? And this antagonism sort of propels you.
Yeah.
And the antagonism that you suffer as an artist, that you deal with, that you have to constantly sort of wade through this sort of reality, actually propels you forward. You need this.
Depends on how strong you are. But it's interesting, we talked about this on the phone before when you mentioned, cities and their increasingly antagonistic nature. And I think it is increasingly true for Berlin as well, especially for artists.
I think it's true across the world, frankly.
It's true across the world. And I think, like everybody else, I was watching Succession on Netflix. And Succession basically depicts a very dystopic corporate world. And when I looked at
conspiracy
and conspiracy, so for me it was when I looked at Succession, I thought they stole everything from Sarah. The way the camera works with this kind of preference for diagonals, for these kind of vertical perspectives, but also the obsession with conspiracy. It is as if your worldview has been adopted by this, or the worldview that kind of occurs in your work.
It's not my worldview.
Yes, but your work or your films suggest a worldview that, for me, weirdly was taken up in Succession. But maybe I projected again.
I think you might be projecting there. But I mean, you have to remember that, like, when I first made Midtown, and I did a show at Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, and I remember the curator writing about outtakes, that like my films are like a series of outtakes from somebody else's film. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's true. It is true because it's like, if you watch Capitol and you see Clinton walking on the South Lawn, you think maybe this could be from somebody else's film. But the truth is actually it's not. It's like I placed myself in that situation very knowingly, and we shot him whistling crossing the South Lawn. But it could be in an outtake. from CBS or NBC or one of the networks. This idea of the outtake, or the idea that all of these images seem very familiar.
Especially when I saw Trump coming back from the hospital after his COVID disease.
I missed
walking,
that.
It made me think of your film immediately, but that might be a déformation professionnelle.
Well, I think there's a big difference, and actually politically, I have to say this. Like, probably I would not be able to make Capital at the moment.
Of course not.
I mean, that was a very unique moment, and I have to tell you how strange it was to make that film, because I lived in London at the time, and I had this. I mean, it was probably some form of homesickness. But I was living in London, and I was living in the Barbican, and I think I was watching All the President's Men, and I was like, I need to make a film about Washington, D.C. I need to make a film about this sort of fantasy of America. And I went to a collector of mine who I didn't know, because also this is a myth that, like, you know your like, I don't really know many of my collectors. But anyway, I went to this guy who lived in DC, who was very involved with Washington politics, who I heard could possibly help me make this film. And I said to him the shot list, and I told him like 20 places I wanted to be in Washington, DC. I said, you know, the Pentagon, and he would say 10%. I would say the Oval Office, he would be like 5%. And this was all like statistics. He spoke in a language of statistics about how likely it was that I could put a camera in those rooms. But the truth be said is that you know, it would be very difficult to have that level of access these times. I mean, I shot that 1 year before 9/11, and it was set even then. It was already in the air. I mean, there was already this like paranoia that something could happen. Obviously, there's always this like paranoia of like something can happen. But it was a strong thing, and I remember thinking, this is sort of a joke. As I filmed the Pentagon parking lot, I remember thinking that if they really thought something was going to happen, I couldn't believe that there was no security. That actually, you know, that it was actually very easy to do what it is that I did. But I don't think that you would end up having a presidential, you know, that you would end up being vouched for, and that they wouldn't, you know, Clinton's administration was very unusual. You know, once you were vouched for, you know, they didn't know what I was filming. You know, they had no idea. They never asked to see any of the footage. They didn't worry about the color. They didn't worry if I made him look bad or if I made him look good. They literally just, once you were vouched for, it was okay. You were one of us. And that was sort of the way they operated, much to their, you know, probably it was problematic.
But, you know, Capital maybe is also the best example, but there are many, many others for your films testifying to a fascination for power centers. You once said that you were very interested to go to the gatekeepers or to the portals of the city for your films. And of course, you know, there are two things. On the one hand, the whole notion of gatekeeping and gatekeepers is discussed very critically nowadays. Because,
well, I usually hate gatekeepers.
Exactly, because gatekeepers are excluding, have been for a long time male, white, and heterosexual, and the power of the gatekeeper has been recently very much questioned for good reasons. On the other hand, there's again a negative flip side to this, because this often can come close to a Trumpian denunciation of expert knowledge and experts. But I was thinking, when I was looking at your films and, you know, and seeing how it is also about, you know, when you get to a city, you want to go where the kind of power is located. Is there maybe also a kind of gendered claim here at work again, meaning as a woman artist, and women artists have for a long time been excluded from these power centers, or at least they have not been treated equally in them or paid less or whatever. Are you trying to claim something like equal access to them? Are you trying to claim like a right to be part of these?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think consciously like that. Whether you could say that is what is going on, I don't know. But I remember, I mean, the idea of like getting over the fence or basically trespassing is something that is, you know, always had a certain validity, you know, and I think it has more to do with less about gender than the role of art. Like, why can't an artist do a piece about Los Angeles? Why would that be a problem? Mm-hmm. Or why can't an artist be in the cabinet room of the White House? It's more about the role of art, and why should art be viewed as somehow marginal? It's like more of fighting that battle than a gendered battle, but I can see how you would possibly read it the way you're suggesting. But it's more about, to me, it's more about challenging the definition of art. Again, going back to like these different arenas that exist, whether they're in one city or across the world. If you have all of these different arenas, why can't art learn from architecture? Why can't art learn from business? Why can't art be involved with fashion? Why can't, do you know what I'm saying? It's more this idea of like an interconnectedness between these things, and why not place yourself in those situations?
But hasn't this battle of a kind of interdisciplinary form of visual art fought? I mean, there are so many artists who aligned themselves with fashion since, I would say, money. Mm-hmm. There are so many artists who aligned themselves with design. There are so many artists. I mean,
I'm not talking about aligning. I'm not talking about aligning yourself or being collected by or being sponsored by. Or I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about making it the subject of your work. Mm-hmm. You know, there's been less of that. I mean, obviously, that has been. I'm not saying it's unique, but it's definitely. It's still a question, right? I mean, for sure, during my lifetime, absolutely, figurative painting is absolutely still going strong. It's not like it disappeared, right? I mean, it
disappeared a little bit, say, in the beginning of the 90s, but mm-hmm. then it came back in strength. But I would also, you know, let me insist on my mm-hmm. gendered perspective. Mm-hmm. Because I also think that your position as a female artist mm-hmm. gets somewhat addressed in some of the paintings. I mean, one of my favorite one is High Heels, mm-hmm. Purple, which is, I would say, a self-portrait in disguise. And then there are other self-portraits.
It's not even in disguise.
It's not even in disguise. It's based on a photograph of your feet and shoes. But then there are other self-portraits which are, you know, abstracting. I mean, they are not, you know, figurative self-portraits. They're pixeling your face and abstracting from the face, but they're nevertheless pointing to an artist whose perspective is that of someone marked and placed as a woman into this society.
Well, definitely the idea of the protagonist of one's own work is oneself. There's no way to get around that, yeah? So whatever you're dealing with, whatever you're fighting, whatever is going on, whether it's just the materials are not behaving or whether you're trying to get permission to do something and you're being told no, or whether somebody has a problem. These are, I mean, you're fighting this, yeah? So this idea of the role of the artist moving through this quagmire of forms, right? In this case, it is female.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And Bettina Funke, in the catalog text of the catalog for the show, she noted something interesting, I mm-hmm. thought. She spoke about the 1990s, mm-hmm. and she proposed that while you were certainly associated with a couple of artistic formations, you were kind of loosely associated with artists from so-called relational aesthetics, and also you certainly knew artists who use film. as a device in their work. And I'm just now realizing we didn't speak about how your films kind of and your paintings have aesthetically a lot in common, but maybe we can still speak about that. But what she basically argued is that while most artists of your generation have been part of an artistic formation, that was somewhat enabling to them, that was like a scene they belonged to, at least in the beginning of their careers, you were more like on your own. Mm-hmm. And that is interesting to me because it made me think of something I've written about 100 years ago, which is the exceptional woman, die Ausnahmefrau in German. And I was interested in researching at the time that in the history of art of the 20th century, every artistic formation up to appropriation art, where it changes, had one successful female artist in the midst of it. In surrealism, it was Meret Oppenheim. In abstract expressionism, it was Helen Frankenthaler, and so on and so forth. So you had one market successful artist per formation, but the kind of negative.
But you said I wasn't part of a formation.
Yes, exactly. But I will come to this. Okay. And the flip side of this was, of course, that this meant that structurally speaking, all the other women who would have also been interesting and who were there were kind of not let in because it could only be one per formation. Now, in your case, it's different. And it's even though, I mean, that sometimes I must tell you, since I'm also often considered an exceptional woman, I have often looked at you as an exceptional woman as well. For me, it's, you know, it's also not a negative characteristic, and it's more like something that happens structurally in one's field. But how was this for you? Like not to be closely aligned with a formation, being still something like an exceptional woman?
Well, I definitely haven't really been alone. I mean, when I moved to New York, I was immediately in the Whitney program. I immediately worked for Jeff Koons. I was definitely around a lot of people who are making art or writing about art or curating work. But as I said, I didn't go to art school. So I wasn't like, I didn't really sort of see how, if anything, I would be slightly critical of this sort of group formation. And probably I always have been, right? So this is like just a personality thing. This is not necessarily anything more than that, you know?
On the other hand, we are all, as Judith Butler would say, constituted by and depending on others.
True. Yeah. Well, I mean, all I can say is that when I talked about this thing of like the different arenas that interested me and how I wanted to place myself, like even when my studio, like my first proper studio, like that was not in my bedroom, which was in Times Square. To me, this was like a conceptual positioning to place myself in Times Square because it just felt like it was the center of this commercial vernacular that we're talking about. It was not Soho. It was not downtown. It was not, you know, the Lower East Side.
It was not where artists had their studios.
No, yeah. It was like across from Port Authority. It was in this zone that had been like, it was in a sort of what I would call like a negative space. It was in a space that the city was going to redevelop and make it Disney, but it hadn't yet happened. Giuliani had this plan. It was like the porn industry and Port Authority, you know, and that's why the studio was the price it was. I mean, there was no lease on the studio because the studio was like about to become another building, right? The building was about to change. But going back to this idea of like the group formation, I mean, I was definitely aware that there was like curation around nationality and that there was curation around the group. And I was always like, probably because of my subject matter, and also because I painted, you know, that I had chosen this. This was like very unusual, right? So people didn't necessarily know how to position my work in relation to that. To me, it was always very clear that, like, obviously, the viewer completes the work. Obviously, like this is like, you don't even have to say this. This is like a fact. One doesn't have to sort of, that wouldn't necessarily be something that would have to be said.
Yes, and at the same time, from the works early on, these linguistic propositions that we have here in the first room up to Lyre, it's interesting because I think that your paintings kind of work like a speech act. They speak to us, even if they are silent. And this is also how I explain to myself this interest in sound. The sound graph paintings are about indexing speech and voice. And I think that there's something, it's because you said in the beginning that you really want to try to produce this impact. And it's an impact, I think, even though one could say that the early paintings are very different looking than, say, Midtown, Capital, Miami, and so on. But for me, there is a red thread that runs through all these works, which is they speak quite loudly to us. They try to, and they also use color as a way. Chroma has always been used by artists as a way to produce a sensual reaction, as a way to produce affect in the viewer, as a way to produce a sense of liveliness. And you use a lot of flesh color, which is the way to produce liveliness since, Diderot's
flesh
times.
Color. Flesh color.
Yeah, flesh color.
I've never thought of that. Where do you see that?
There's a lot of flesh color in your paintings. If pink is flesh.
Oh, okay, pink is flesh. Is red flesh?
That's a question for you.
I don't know. I think about adrenaline. I think about this never-ending sort of, as I say, movement, not just of the eye, but of thought. As you say, the conversation. So an exhibition makes a conversation. One's work makes a conversation with others. And you don't know necessarily who those others are, but you're making this conversation as you're building your work. This conversation I've always sort of thought about, and it's actually the sort of driving force of my work. And I would probably argue is the driving force of many people's work, is this conversation. And this conversation is like never ending, right? This conversation, it keeps going on because these are unresolved issues, right? So you're using everything that you have, whether it's chroma, as you say, whether it's the pitch, whether it's subject matter, whether it's titles, you're using all of these things to try to create this conversation, both visually, intellectually. You're developing this sort of language. And it's one of the reasons why I thought it would be interesting to have some of the, whatever you want to call it, detritus, archival material, studio crap, that's in the vitrines, because I think there's many things that create an image. Many things, and it's like, it's infinite. Like, it's very hard to pinpoint three or four things. Yeah, it's very impossible to pinpoint the origin of whether, as you say, of being in a group or making a singular image. But to make images, it's there's a lot that goes into that. It's many conversations. It's actually impossible to sort of picture the constellation of things that goes into why you choose to make this piece or this film or not that film. There's been many things that have influenced that. And, I've also had people, ideas for images in films, for instance, that don't transpire, but, maybe it's okay not to become an image. Yeah, that this is okay too. Yeah, you can have a conversation with somebody, and I have, around Los Angeles, for example, where a conversation goes on about, being an image, and actually it doesn't transpire. This still affects the work. This still is part of the history of the work. And I know the history, And I thought this would be interesting to incorporate these other types of elements that go into like the decision-making, the problems, the permissions, the hierarchies that do exist that I've obviously had to use.
And the networking that has to be done.
To try to get into certain places, because actually it is very difficult. And I don't think it's just difficult because, you know, you're a woman. I think it's difficult because you're an artist. And I don't say that in some sort of macho way. Like, I'm not saying that because I'm dismissing what you're saying. It's a serious issue. But I do think that, like, it's quite hard if you go into, like, you know, if you go to the International Olympic Committee and you say, I want to film this spectacle, because we're talking about spectacle, we're talking about performance, we're talking about a commodity that is like the athlete, right? And if you go in and you say, I want to be in this position where I capture these events, and you're not writing a check, you have to have, I mean, that's a very difficult position to, that's a difficult conversation to have, because you have to prove to them why would they bother.
I think it's indeed difficult for everyone, but I think there is a metaphoric difference, or maybe I think that your work is also about insisting of having, of pushing for this access as a woman artist. You know, I think that is there as a message. And I was also very interested when looking at the exhibition to realize how codependent the films and the paintings are. How, as you know, you just pointed to that, how there are elements, say the roof of the Olympic tent in Munich in 1972, that consists of these diagonals, of these shapes again, that then we might find in your paintings or not. So there seems to be...
Or how the Olympic Park is made of the rubble.
Yeah.
I mean, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, fantastic as it's far out. It's like a very extraordinary concept. I don't know who was that Otto Leiker and Benisch that came up with this
I think so,
idea?
yeah. And also I thought that it was a smart idea to show the posters, because the posters
I love the posters.
I like them too, because they're film posters, but then they are also posters that...
Oh, my posters.
Your posters.
I thought you were talking about the posters of 1972.
Oh, that's good too. Yeah. But now I was talking about the posters in this show, the film posters that are also posters that kind of have your, say, pictorial language on them. And they are a fusion. They, for me, embody a kind of fusion between your paintings and your films. And the same is in a way true for the sound graph paintings, because they often are derived from a sound that, you know, even with a person who you interviewed for a film. So I think film and paintings, even though they run parallel, there are moments where they become one and where it becomes very clear that they are absolutely codependent on one another.
Well, just time-based, they are codependent. And they could be, it could be said that, like, the paintings, my paintings are actually very slow and very, like, you can't really rush them, even though I try sometimes. They're very, you know, it has to proceed at its own speed, and there's nothing sort of you can do, right? So it's like they just sort of, they become, and it's like quite slow. And at the same time, the films are actually, they take quite a long time to conceive of or to research, but they're actually very fast in relation to the paintings in making them. So in this space, it could be argued, you know, like both are based on coordinates, on this sort of imagining of place or positioning yourself somehow in space, but they're dependent on each other, because if I made any other type of painting, I would never have the time to make the films, or vice versa. They're actually temporally not just subject matter dependent, right? They're always all going on at the same time, which is quite sometimes quite a lot. because this could be the work of, I mean, at times it merges, at times it becomes more schizophrenic in the sense of like, this could be the work of two different artists merging, yeah? But I think that it allows me to make paintings and make films and do what I have done, allows me to like operate in many different spheres. Because I would not want to be just making paintings. Like this would not be interesting enough for me.
But I would lastly like to address your more recent paintings, because I think something quite different happens in them, which is the spider webs. I mean, they are, first of all, based on natural phenomena and not on corporate structures. So that's one thing that is different about them. And then when I looked at them, I thought these are paintings that kind of present dissolving structures to me. They kind of fall apart. They are kaleidoscopic, but in a way that is disorienting, rather turbulent. They consist on these points that a bit function like figures. And these figures kind of seem to desperately float around, looking for some sort of residual stability that they don't have. Also, the colors of these paintings are somewhat colder. So it is as if a world in crisis got depicted here with the help of the spiderweb motif. It's as if, I mean, I know that you did them during or after the pandemic, and during the pandemic, it's really like they stand for a world that we can't get under control anymore. They seem to really, even though they depict some natural phenomenon, they are still a lot about culture, and something disintegrates, something really doesn't hold up anymore in them in a very interesting way.
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly what to say about them other than that I made them during the pandemic, and as I left New York City, in March 2020, I sort of thought to myself, this is quite interesting because now one has to really, I mean, as you start to think about the climate and about sort of the effect of globalization, yeah, because this is like, it was very extreme, I was leaving the city and it was like, there was an empty highway. There was no one on the highway. And I was driving up to Massachusetts and I was thinking to myself, actually, it's inconceivable to not think of the city as also an organic form. Mm-hmm. That it's not possible to see anymore that these buildings, that this condensation, this congestion that is like called New York, that was like emptying out and sort of disintegrating, seemingly, that's now back. That this is also, that we have to view this as also organic, meaning, that it's not possible to make a binary system of you have the city and then you have organic. No, it's like all just one. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about this sort of, again, this pulse, this eye thing that I was talking to you about, which is how one perceives and how one has focus and how one is thinking about time. And so for me, that they were studies, sort of local studies, I should say, in the sense of like, I was thinking about this engineering of the spider web and of the sort of this improvisational form, this form that is sort of like, okay, yes, it's a metaphor, but it is this incredibly clever thing that's constantly adapting, constantly getting ripped, constantly in crisis. It's constantly I mean, it's not only a habitat, it's a predation sort of structure. What is this thing? And it's like, they're basically all around us. And it's like, if you stop and look, that this form is seemingly non-authored, but it's actually constantly a labor too.
Created.
Yeah. So, I mean, I started looking at this and started thinking also about I was really thinking about the vision of the city when I was making them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the spider webs as a kind of metaphor.
I was really like literally looking at them.
That's how it looks. It looks as if you were interested in how they are constructed.
Yeah.
You're really treating them like
But I mean,
structures.
the spider, I mean, it's in the Chicago film. Like this has been there, like, you know, this has been there like right from the beginning. It's in the films. And in terms of the organic form, like in the Rio series, when I was looking at Niemeyer or Burle Marx, and you look at these sort of looking at the shape of the curve and of the sort of, I mean, I don't know whether you call it female or like Niemeyer used this sort of analogy, or whether you think of it as botanical, what does it matter, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a very good moment, first of all, to applaud Sarah. And so I guess I will play the part of the moderator now, because I'm sure there are questions.
For your painted work, I don't know whether you have one or multiple studios. What is the minimum condition for your studio to work for you? What does it have to have?
A physical studio?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it needs to have...
If I would put you on a meadow under a tree, would you be able to paint?
What do I need as a minimum?
Yeah.
That's a great question. You need 4 walls, a door that locks, okay? A door that locks, because I once had a studio that I had a fight with a landlord, and they punched a hole through the wall, and I had a door that did not function. So you have to have a door that locks. You have to have a hardware store. You have to have probably a computer. You definitely need to have energy.
The evolutionary process of labor, infinitive, may this be the reason why you think that all systems fail?
No, I don't think so. I think the sort of infinite sort of forms of labor that are constantly going around us, whether they're organic or otherwise, a lot of those forms are actually very interesting. It's sort of how they're utilized and how they're structured by governments or leaders that lead to forms of failure. I mean, it's not necessarily that the labor itself is problematic.
I also thought of this title as a performative contradiction that is quite deliberate, because all systems fail, and at the same time, all systems do not fail. I mean, as this show proves. So I thought there was a kind of play with that. It's also saying the opposite.
Well, I think it's good to be aware of contradictions, and I think we're all part of that. And certainly, anybody who claims that they're not, I'm very suspicious of.
More questions?
So looking back on those years, like 30 years ago, and all this time that has been passed, what is your feeling when you're looking at all this collection, all the art you have been constructed, and how do you see the world has been changing or maybe not changing in all that time?
In the last 3 years or over?
No, the 30 years.
The 30 years. Oh, 30 years.
Small question.
Oh, wow.
Or maybe just like, what is your feeling and how can you see the world
I think
has been
things
changed?
are much more tenuous now. I think it's much more unclear now where things are actually going. That's what I would say to looking back. I think things seemed more, now I don't know if that's just a sort of beginning in a city, or whether it's really the times we live in right now, but I would definitely say that I think power is much more in flux right now than it has ever been. And I'm not just talking about gender, I'm talking about governments, corporations, everything. Like it seems very clear that things can change in a minute. I don't think it felt quite like that 25, 30 years ago. And I think that's actually not a bad thing, that it feels so tenuous.
What is the story behind the little circles where there's a couple of, like one paper per month for 2020 and 2021?
This was just like a form of like a diary in a way. They were just like a form of playing with occupying myself while I wasn't technically in my studio.
So it doesn't reflect your mood or the moon?
No, they were done. They're based off of a lunar calendar, okay, that is configured, and my version of a calendar.
But isn't the turn to nature that the lunar series implies the first step also toward the spiderweb paintings?
Probably. But also, I mean, I've always loved calendars. You know, I love calendars. I love the idea of that movement, you know, like either looking forward to something or looking back. You know, this sort of progression of time. I think this is interesting, and it's something that was really challenged for me, for sure, during that time period where it's like, you know, it was very hard to, I mean, one was communicating so much, but at the same time, it was not clear where we were, when we were. Yeah, so it was an exercise that I don't think it clarified anything for me, but it emphasized this situation.
Do you have a physical or a digital calendar yourself?
A what?
A physical or digital calendar?
A what?
Physical or digital calendar?
Do I have a physical? I have both. I have lots of calendars. I have calendars from diners, gas stations. Of course, I have iCal, which is like, I hate it. It doesn't function properly. And it's not possible to track everything. You know, when you do searches, you can't really find things. So it's very dysfunctional. I mean, it'd be fun to invent a new calendar, like a proper functioning calendar.
I would like to ask a question regarding the earliest works which we have in the show, which are the sign paintings and the police radio. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what made you make them in the first place. What was the idea, or what was the impetus to like, first of all, to make these paintings, and also to put these, transform these signs into paintings?
Well, first of all, I was like teaching myself how to paint. You have to remember that. And second of all, I was like really, I mean, I was loving sort of this, loving this sort of language of the hardware store. So I was thinking about these sort of boundaries of private property, really, because that's what they sort of all configure around, which actually it's interesting that later on, when I was shooting Midtown, I was like told by the film crew that I hired that day, because it was shot in a single day by this news crew that I hired, and they told me about the property lines in New York City, that they're embedded in the sidewalk. And this is interesting to me, again, because they said, well, you can't cross over that property line because then you're on Chase Bank's territory. And I thought, this is completely irrelevant. Like, because obviously the camera doesn't obey any type of property lines, right? I mean, like, if you, I can shoot right into Chase Bank. But the early paintings were going back to this sense of like picturing adrenaline, or picturing this sort of sense inside of this form of adrenaline, and this idea of crossing boundaries, or this idea of, yeah, as you would talk about, this identity formation of going on, who is on the other side, who is commanding these sort of dictums of how you operate in space. This is what I was thinking about as I was making those paintings. And the police radio for me was like a form of mapping, and a form of thinking about New York City, of all of these stories that are constantly going on, an infinite amount of conversations and stories that you'll really never know the end of. You know, like, we'll never know. I mean, even a huge amount of research would not lead to a conclusion to these stories that I recorded on the police radio. I also love that actually, it just has to be said that it is a police dispatcher who is a woman. Yeah.
Yeah, and this stands in interesting contrast to the 3 films where you interviewed only men, which is Kluge, Robert Town, and the nice police person from
Dr.
Munich.
George Sieber.
Genau, Siebert, Herr Siebert. So there's 3 guys whose voices we hear.
But it could be said that all 3 guys, Dr. George Sieber, Alexander Kluge, and Robert Town, they all tell a story, prescriptive story, about the way they came to work, the way their city evolved, the way they decided to be where they are, and the way they decided to navigate that city, whether it worked or not.
I would like to ask whether you don't find it a little contradictory to, on the one hand, start off with a system critique, and on the other hand, taking up your thread with the difference of evaluating work, that if you have an art piece, it's of course evaluated with much more money than a person cleaning the floor, although it might be the same beauty in the way looking at it. And whether it's a contradiction to have the product, which ends up being, in a way, a very highly decorative, expensive thing on the wall. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't really think about that. I mean, I definitely don't think about the art market as much as Isabelle does. But
not true.
But, you know, I think that it's not possible. I mean, like, art object can be obviously decorative, so can a book, so can a flower, you know? I mean, like, yeah, anything can be very decorative. A person can be decorative. You can use a person like that too. I mean, like, it doesn't really mean anything to say something can be decorative.
Yeah, but the flower probably wouldn't suggest to be system critiques.
I don't think it's a contradiction. I think it's sort of like that's just the way things are. I mean, things can be used for many purposes. Like, I'm not in charge of the way people use things. You know, I'm only in charge of like what I make. I can't be responsible for how things are distributed down to the absolute end. I'm not Coca-Cola. I can't figure out exactly how to distribute and have the portions and have the consumption and have the sugar content. Like, I'm not in charge of everything. You have to, I mean, as an artist, you have to realize that right at the beginning, and you have to accept that this is fine. I mean, writers are in the same position. I mean, it's no different.
And if I may add, I think that especially your paintings are obviously aware of their status as commodity objects. They are also, negotiating their proximity to luxury items. These things seem to be, I think, negotiated in the work. These paintings don't pretend to be anything else than the specific commodity that an artwork is. But they also remind us that an artwork is a commodity not like any other commodity, due to reasons that I can't get into now.
Hello. I have a simple question. When did you start painting? Maybe in your childhood or in your school days? And what did you paint? And when did you start your career? Or how?
That's a really hard question.
Or who
it's
inspired
not really
you? Was
possible
it yourself?
to remember how you, when you started, but I do remember one thing, and I'm not going to tell the story again that I told the other night here about going to New York when I was 3. But one thing I know is that definitely I've always associated making art with traveling. I don't know why, but I think I know why. And it's because when I used to travel as a kid, I would be able to get almost any type of art supplies that I wanted, right? And it was really like on the back of an airplane seat that this would be your studio. This would be like your space to make work and to think without any type of constraints. And so I sort of always viewed moving. I always related somehow travel or a destination in relation to making work. So I guess that would be pretty young.
What are your thoughts about AI? Do you follow the development? Is this something that you're...
Yeah, I was talking about it last night, actually.
Oh, okay.
I don't follow it, no. And I don't have the app, no. But I do talk to artists about it, and I was talking last night about it, and somebody wanted to feed a group in Munich that is developing, doing research in AI and is like, could possibly help us make a film. I mean, I'm interested in it, but obviously it's a terrifying idea. Yeah.
We don't know what's going to happen. Like you said before, everything is possible. We are not, we don't see the past.
But I'm wary of the iPhone, and I have it, so.
Me too. Okay, so I think we can call it a night. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions.